HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Eisenhower versus Warren, The Battle for Civil Rights and Liberties, by James F. Simon. Read by Jonathan Yen. You call Lincoln a radical, but every bit of reading I have done on his life convinces me that in many ways he was the greatest compromiser and the most astute master of expedients that we have known. I believe that the true radical is the fellow who is standing in the middle and battling both extremes. President Dwight D. Eisenhower to Brigadier General Bradford G. Chenoweth. Through politics, which has been defined as the art of the possible, progress could be made, and most often was made, by compromising and taking half a loaf where a whole loaf could not be obtained. The opposite is true so far as the judicial process was concerned. Through it, and particularly in the Supreme Court, the basic ingredient of decision is principle, and it should not be compromised and parceled out a little in one case, a little more in another, until eventually someone receives the full benefit. If the principle is sound and constitutional, it is the birthright of every American, not to be accorded begrudgingly or piecemeal or to special groups only, but to everyone in its entirety whenever it is brought into play. Chief Justice Earl Warren, recalling a conversation with retired President Eisenhower in which he distinguished the obligations of the political and judicial branches of government. In the 60s, Eisenhower frequently remarked that his biggest mistake was the appointment of that dumb son of a bitch, Earl Warren. Quoted in Eisenhower, the President, by Stephen E. Ambrose. Prologue. For a president who was not a lawyer, Eisenhower had very firm ideas on the qualities he was looking for in a Chief Justice. His appointee must have a national reputation for honesty and fairness, possess wide experience in law and government, and be a statesman who could lead the court. When he announced his decision to appoint Governor Earl Warren of California to be Chief Justice of the United States on September 30th, 1953, he praised Warren's character, his government experience, his moderate philosophy, and predicted that he would make a great Chief Justice. Although the two men did not know each other well, the President and the new Chief Justice were photographed together in easy camaraderie shortly after Warren's appointment. Less than 6 months later, that camaraderie had evaporated, and so had their mutual respect. The disintegration of their professional relationship began on the evening of February 8, 1954, at a White House stag dinner in which the Chief Justice, as the honored guest, was seated next to the President. 2 months earlier, the court had heard oral arguments in Brown v. Board of Education, the legal challenge to public school segregation, and a decision was expected before the end of the judicial term. And yet the President seated John W. Davis, the attorney for South Carolina in the case, who had argued passionately against school desegregation, near Warren, and told the Chief Justice what a great man Mr. Davis was. Later, Eisenhower compounded what Warren considered an unpardonable ethical lapse by taking him aside and assuring him that white Southerners were not bad people, but only concerned that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big, overgrown Negroes. 3 months later, Warren announced the Brown decision for a unanimous Supreme Court, declaring that the separation of public school students by race was unconstitutional. Within a few hours of the announcement of the Brown decision, the Voice of America had broadcast the news to foreign countries in 35 languages. The decision was widely acclaimed in the United States and later considered a catalyst for the modern civil rights movement in this country. At his first press conference after the Brown decision was announced, Eisenhower's response was conspicuously brief. He said that the court's decision was now the law and should be obeyed. A year later, when the court handed down its implementation decision in Brown, ordering the dismantling of the segregated public school system in the South and border states, with all deliberate speed, the president's support remained minimal. The law should be obeyed, he said. But he also called for understanding of the white South, where both custom and law had been turned upside down. Law alone, he said repeatedly, could not change people's hearts or minds. Resistance to Brown in the Deep South quickly gained momentum. By legal maneuvering in court and violence and intimidation outside, the region effectively fought the court's Brown mandate throughout Eisenhower's presidency. Warren never forgave Eisenhower for his failure to put the prestige and moral force of the presidency behind the court's decision. Nor was he impressed when Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957 to uphold the law. Warren thought that the president should have acted sooner to support Brown and to quell the violence that erupted when 9 black teenagers attempted to integrate the city's Central High School. A decade earlier, Eisenhower had earned his reputation as the superb military leader of Allied forces that defeated Germany in World War II. Although he had no combat experience before the war, he won the respect of field commanders and GIs alike for his uncanny ability to get the job done under the most excruciating pressure. As president, he also focused on accomplishing his objectives, which included averting violence in the Deep South after Brown. His middle-of-the-road approach meant that he exhorted all Americans to uphold the law while counseling understanding of those in the Deep South who denounced the court's decision. That delicate balancing act required him to constantly preach respect for the law, but, at the same time, show patience for those moderate leaders in the South who needed time to implement Brown. In eliminating racial discrimination, Eisenhower's actions spoke louder than his words. He wielded his executive authority decisively to complete the desegregation of the armed forces. He also desegregated naval yards and public schools on military bases in the South, Veterans Administration hospitals, and public schools and restaurants in the District of Columbia. He appointed judges at all levels in the federal court system, including 4 Supreme Court justices after Warren, who supported the Brown decision. And he lobbied behind the scenes for the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Eisenhower never publicly criticized Warren's opinion for the court in Brown, but privately he complained that the court should have been more prudent and moved incrementally. During his second presidential term, when it was obvious that the Brown mandate was not being obeyed in the Deep South, Eisenhower cautioned his Attorney General, William Rogers, to tone down a speech he had drafted that called for vigorous enforcement of the Brown Decree. Complete desegregation of the public schools in the South, Eisenhower predicted, would take many years, perhaps decades, and it would be accomplished with persuasion and education, not solely by judicial mandate. The Eisenhower-Warren clash extended to the protection of civil liberties during the red-hunting McCarthy era. Eisenhower loathed the tactics of the reckless anti-communist Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, but never confronted him publicly. In a speech during his 1952 presidential campaign in Wisconsin, Eisenhower eliminated a paragraph in which he had defended General George C. Marshall, his mentor and boss during World War II, against McCarthy's baseless charges that Marshall was disloyal. After his election, Eisenhower adamantly refused to condemn McCarthy publicly, justifying his silence as a tactical decision to deprive the senator of the confrontation and publicity that he craved. During Eisenhower's second presidential term, Chief Justice Warren often spoke for a court majority that upheld the constitutional rights of suspected communists. Rabid anti-communists in the Senate, like Senator William Jenner of Indiana, charged that the Warren court rulings threatened national security and referred contemptuously to their Red Monday decisions. Eisenhower reacted angrily to many of those Warren court decisions, but confined his criticism to private conversations. When the president's criticism was reported in the press, he wrote the Chief Justice a brief letter saying that the press reports had exaggerated his reaction. Warren's reply was correct, but frosty. Warren later recalled a conversation with Eisenhower in which the former president criticized those communist cases. How could two of the most revered American leaders of the 20th century so profoundly disagree on their approach to the protection of basic civil rights and liberties? The lessons to be learned are as relevant and instructive today as they were more than 50 years ago. Chapter 1. Man of the West. The calm, confident face of California's Governor Earl Warren beamed from the cover of Time magazine on January 31, 1944. Time considered this man of the West the front-runner for the Republican Party's vice presidential nomination, presumably on the ticket with New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey in their party's challenge to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in November. Life magazine went further, suggesting in a flattering story on Warren and his large photogenic family that the California governor might even head his party's presidential ticket. Warren, 52 years old, had become a star on the national political stage barely a year after he had been elected to his first gubernatorial term. The appeal of a Dewey-Warren ticket was obvious. Both men led large states from opposite coasts with a treasure trove of electoral college votes. Both had earned reputations as fearless prosecutors who had sent scores of corrupt officials, bootleggers, con men, and murderers to prison. Both were dedicated family men without a scintilla of scandal in their private lives. And they represented the moderate middle of their party, not as liberal as the party's 1940 standard-bearer Wendell Willkie, but more progressive than the leader of the conservative wing of the party, Ohio Senator Robert A. Taft. Warren offered a contrast in style and personality to Dewey. Whereas Dewey tirelessly promoted his image as an intrepid racket-buster, Warren was more low-key, though he, too, cultivated reporters. Dewey was combative, while Warren seemed to radiate goodness and warmth, impressing visitors with his relaxed good nature and his evident simplicity. Time reported that Warren's many admirers considered him not only to be a perfect political candidate, but also the forerunner in U.S. politics to a new era of friendly men to succeed the recent era of angry men. Time's examples of angry men included Louisiana's late Senator Huey Long and New York City's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Nothing in Warren's speeches during his 25 years in public office could explain the adulation. He was neither scintillating in style nor original in policy. But his patient, indefatigable work ethic produced impressive results. In a mere 71 days of the state legislative session, Governor Warren had pushed through bills that reduced the state sales tax, increased old-age pensions, established a post-war Reconstruction and Reemployment Commission, and earmarked $43 million of state funds for post-war development. Earl Warren's father, Matthias "Matt" Warren, was an infant when his family emigrated to the United States in 1866 from southern Norway. Like many Scandinavian families in the mid-19th century, the Warrens, anglicized from Varen, sought the open spaces of the upper Midwest that most resembled their native land. Matt's father, a small farmer in Norway, attempted to resume his occupation in rural Illinois and later in Eagle Grove, Iowa. The family grew, 5 boys and 3 girls, but the meager farm income could not support them. Matt and his older brother Ola, therefore, were parceled out to neighboring farmers, earning their room and board by doing chores. After Matt completed the 7th grade, he and Ola moved to Chicago, where Ola died of tuberculosis in his brother's arms. Penniless and alone, Matt vowed that he would never be broke again. Earl Warren was born on March 19, 1891, on what was then called Dingy Turner Street, in a poor neighborhood of Los Angeles. Matthias had moved to Southern California from the Midwest a year earlier and begun working for the Southern Pacific as a repairman and car inspector. On his modest income, he struggled to support his wife, Crystal, a Swedish immigrant, their daughter Ethel, 4 years old, and their infant son. Soon after Earl's birth, Matthias went out on strike with other railroad workers in sympathy for the nationwide Pullman strike and, as a result, was blacklisted by the railroad's Los Angeles office. He moved his family to the dusty, desolate town of Sumner, California, outside of Bakersfield in the Joaquin Valley, where he again found employment with the Southern Pacific. Although the railroad was Matthias's employer for 30 years, he told his son that the corporation did not respect its workers or treat them fairly. Earl, like his father, witnessed the railroad's indifference to workers' debilitating injuries and the instant dismissals of unneeded workers without warning or severance. The experience ingrained in both father and son an enduring suspicion of large corporations. "Earl, saving is a habit, like drinking, smoking, or spending," Matthias Warren told his only son when he was growing up in the small town of Sumner. "Always save some part of what you earn." Thrift was one of the important lessons that Earl Warren learned from his father, who was the greatest influence in his life. Matthias also valued education, insisting that Earl graduate from high school in Bakersfield when the children of most railroad workers had dropped out. Despite Matthias's modest income, he saved enough to pay for his son's college and law school education at the Berkeley campus of the University of California. The Warren family lived in a small row house across the street from the railroad yard in Sumner, a town of a few hundred people, a scattering of stores, saloons, gambling dens, and small hotels. The hotel patrons were usually itinerant railroad workers, known as boomers, or French and Basque sheep herders who came to town to market their livestock in the winter. This rugged frontier town seemed especially ill-suited for the intense, teetotaling Matthias Warren. Unlike the rootless boomers, he was a devoted family man who adhered to a strict moral code and believed in perpetual self-improvement. He took correspondence courses in accounting and mechanics and taught Earl to read and write before he was 5 years old. When Earl was in elementary school, he earned money delivering baked goods in a covered wagon in the early morning hours and carrying blocks of ice to homes in the summer heat that soared above 100 degrees. Working for the railroad as a teenager, his favorite job was as a caller, responsible for finding and rousing boomers to make sure they boarded departing trains for their next job. He searched for them in saloons and gambling dens, and, if unsuccessful, in their rooming houses and hotels. He proudly recalled that he never failed to find his man. He also had fun, especially riding his burro, Jack, chasing jackrabbits and trapping squirrels. His most exciting adventure occurred in April 1903, after he heard the news of a shootout between a notorious bandit named Jim McKinney and the Bakersfield marshal and his deputy, both of whom had been killed. The murdered deputy was Bert Tibbett, the father of Lawrence Tibbett, the famous Metropolitan Opera baritone. The boy rode his burro to the scene of the crime, a Chinese gambling house. The Chinese population of Bakersfield was comprised of laborers who had been brought in to build and maintain the railroad. Later, when another deputy, not the bandit, was accused of the murder of the two lawmen, young Warren attended the trial, his dramatic introduction to his future career as a prosecutor. The defendant was found guilty and later slit his own throat in the local jail. When the mesmerizing orator Russell Conwell delivered his inspirational Acres of Diamonds sermon in Bakersfield, young Warren listened intently and, decades later, recalled the details of the address. Greatness, said Conwell, was found in small deeds, providing better streets and sidewalks, schools and colleges, more happiness and more civilization. Highly moralistic in tone, yet practical in advice, Conwell's lessons shaped Warren, who would later set his own moralistic, practical agenda as District Attorney of Alameda County, Attorney General and Governor of California, and Chief Justice of the United States. Warren was a good, if uninspired, student in high school who in his graduating class, Will, bequeathed his ability to slide through, doing as little work as possible. His most vivid memory from high school was not of a favorite teacher or class, but of his triumph in being reinstated after his principal suspended him shortly before graduation. He and 2 other seniors had been rehearsing for the senior play into the early morning hours, overslept, and missed the final graduation rehearsal. The principal suspended them for their truancy, but they appealed their suspensions to the school board and were allowed to graduate. It was not the last time that Earl Warren would take satisfaction in challenging authority that he considered unjust. Warren thoroughly enjoyed his 6 years at Berkeley, but by his own admission, he was not a serious student. "I had no intention of failing," he wrote, "but neither did I have a burning desire for knowledge." Shortly after arriving on campus, he joined the La Junta Club, a local fraternal organization, and spent his happiest hours talking, eating, playing cards, and drinking beer with his fraternity brothers. While at Berkeley, he grew to his adult height of over 6 feet tall and put on 30 pounds to weigh 200. He was an enthusiastic reader outside of class and listed Kipling, Dickens, and the California author Jack London among his favorites. He and his fraternity brothers spent memorable evenings at the First and Last Chance Saloon, an Oakland waterfront bar frequented by London, where the author regaled them with tales of his adventures in the frozen North and the South Seas. Although Warren was not active in campus politics, he took a particular interest in a moralistic, reform-minded young prosecutor named Hiram Johnson, who soon successfully ran for governor of California. As governor, Johnson instituted a series of progressive measures, making government more transparent and responsive to the voters, and curbing the political and economic power of large corporations like the Southern Pacific. When Warren was elected governor more than 3 decades later, he hung only one photograph in his office, that of Hiram Johnson. In Warren's senior year, he entered the law school at Bolt Hall, but did not find the school's theoretical case method, patterned on Harvard's, stimulating. "This did not appear to me to be a practical approach to becoming a lawyer," he recalled. To learn practical legal skills, he spent a few hours a day in a Berkeley law office, in violation of the law school's regulations. At the law firm, he served papers and did anything of a non-technical character that was asked of me. Almost a half-century later, Chief Justice Warren's judicial opinions reflected the practical approach that he had preferred as early as law school. After graduation, Warren accepted a job in the law department of a small oil company in San Francisco. He remembered his boss, Edmund Toski, as an irascible old man who never addressed him by name. Toski ordered the young attorney around like a petty clerk, constantly criticizing his work and taking credit for anything Warren did that he found useful. Worst of all, he humiliated him by sending him downtown on personal errands, often to buy his favorite cigars. Warren left his job after a year, even though he had not found another. Before departing, he reprimanded his boss for running an office with no human dignity. Shortly after leaving Toski's firm, Warren was hired by the Oakland firm of Robinson & Robinson, where he kept the court calendar for the entire office, served as legman to the courthouse on minor matters, and researched cases for the senior partner. After the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Warren volunteered for the Army's Officers' Corps, but was turned down twice, first due to the flood of applicants, and later because of hemorrhoids and ether pneumonia. Finally, he enlisted, rising to the rank of first lieutenant, and was sent as a bayonet instructor to Camp MacArthur in Waco, Texas, 2 days before the armistice was signed. He remained intensely patriotic throughout his life. In 1941, when he was 50 years old and the Attorney General of California, he planned to accept a commission in the Army after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. He changed his mind only after being persuaded to run for governor. And in 1963, when he first resisted President Lyndon B. Johnson's entreaties to head the commission investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy, LBJ successfully appealed to his patriotism. At Warren's request, he would be buried in Arlington Cemetery with full military honors. Warren was still wearing his military uniform when he returned to California in January 1919. Thanks to the recommendations of 2 friends who had been elected to the state legislature, he was hired as clerk of the Judiciary Committee of the State Assembly at $6 a day. Though he held the job for only a few months of the 1919 legislative session, his most indelible memories were of corrupt legislators who lined their own pockets instead of doing the people's business. Some, he recalled, could be bought by lobbyists for a steak, a potato, or a girl. Others specialized in so-called cinch bills, in which they introduced legislation calculated to hurt vulnerable businessmen, then withdrew the bill at a price to the targeted victim. The sobering experience did not deter him from public service. Indeed, that clerkship was the beginning of a career in government that spanned a half-century. For the next 5 years, he worked as a deputy city attorney in Oakland and as assistant district attorney in the office of Ezra Dakota. During that time, he also met his future wife, an attractive young widow named Nina Myers, a Swedish immigrant who was raising her son while managing a woman's specialty shop in Oakland. Though Warren worked long hours, he found time to court Nina, taking her to dinner and the theater on Saturday evenings.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?